Welcome. We're going to get started. We're already a couple of minutes past 2, and it's always an interesting balance when you have an international community in India, because the joke in India is that IST stands for Indian Stretchable Time. To balance that with the right on timeness of international communities, it feels like starting 2 or 3 minutes late is about as good of a compromise as we should allow ourselves and begin. This session is on really looking at the vulnerable communities, because as leaders of faith, as leaders of faith-based organizations, as leaders from United Nations, from other sectors, we're all doing our very best. We're all aiming to the extent possible to provide whatever care we give, whether it's in education, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in feeding, whether it's in housing, whatever spheres we may be working in. We aim to reach as many as we possibly can. We aim to impact as many as we possibly can, to touch as many as we possibly can. And yet, you only have to work in these areas for 5 minutes to realize that there's not only a lot of people, quantity-wise, but there's very specific communities, quality-wise, who almost inevitably we end up leaving behind unless there is very clear, very specific, and very conscientious efforts that are put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. And these communities, depending on the sector you're working in, depending on where you are in the world, range from groups including women, to children, to urban poor, to the disabled, to the LGBTQ communities, and so many other groups who are so frequently left behind in whatever form of development, poverty eradication, provision of services that we are working for. So today we are going to be talking about the challenges, but also hopefully solutions, best practices for addressing those challenges. Because while of course it's important to be honest and transparent about what the challenges are, it's equally important to look at how are we able to solve them. What are the ways that we or anyone in this room has been able to overcome any of those challenges so that we may actually learn from each other and ideally walk out of this room with fewer challenges than we walked in with, and be more equipped, more able to ensure that fewer and fewer people, quantity-wise, fewer and fewer communities, quality-wise, are left behind. So we'll begin with a discussion with our esteemed panelists, and then we will open it up to those of you who are here, whether for questions to the panel specifically, or other questions, or sharing your own aspects on this topic. It's a panel come round table that isn't actually round discussion group. So just envision us sitting in a round circle, and you'll feel inspired to participate, because we really do want these sessions to be participatory, not just us speaking to you. So with that, I have the joy of introducing my esteemed panelists, or our esteemed panelists, beginning from my far left, Opar Sri Suwan, correct? If I mispronounce anything, please let me know. For Sri Suwan. She is the project manager on child protection and women's empowerment from the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. And we will begin with her. I will ask her to speak about which specific communities, which specific vulnerable communities in your mind and in your work are of the greatest concern and the greatest likelihood to be left behind.
Okay, I start then. Hi. Can you hear my heart beat? And it's saying thank you, and thank you. So it's my humble. I'm feeling really humble here, and also proud that I'm sitting here among friends. I will start asking you to put your right hand up. Yes, all of you. It's lunch. After lunch, it's always difficult to focus. So, and after that, you put it on your heart. Close your eyes. Have you ever been called abnormal, not real, mentally ill? Have you ever been asked, are you man or woman? Or what are you? Have you ever been told that, oh, maybe you have done something in your past life that now you are not man or woman or neither? Please open your eyes. Thank you. So what I'm going to, this is the most vulnerable group that I'm going to speak, and I know it is not comfort to some of the ears out there, or we have our own perspective of things. I have a lot to unlearn to be able to speak this through the heart. I have prepared some of the statement, but yes, I can feel that the energy here is that you would rather look at me in the eyes and let's say that, yes, there's a lot to unlearn and relearn. So this is, I'm not speaking, I'm speaking here on behalf of my Gandayana Mitra, my friends, who are identifying themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and plus there are more to explore. So those questions and that stigma have been there since the beginning of time, and especially in children who cannot express themselves, who that they can't say that, oh, I'm a transgender, I want to be gay. Because of that, their parents might not love them. Because of the faith community say that, is that you that have done something bad in your past life that you've been born to this world, not man or woman. So this is what we have to unlearn. Is this also, it's like you peeling off the onions. It's really nice when you fried it, but before you get there, you also have to peel off the skin, right? So yes, but that's water will clean our eye, so we can see true things. We can see human at the human. And I want to say that, so the principle of living, how much time do I have? Yes, okay. So, coming back to this, leaving no one behind, I think we didn't leave them behind. We have not yet included them. So it's never too late that we start thinking about them now. We start thinking about our friends who are not here, who are not yet there to stand up and say, yes, I'm a bisexual in these faith communities. So the principle of leaving no one behind emphasizes the importance of ensuring that everyone can enjoy their full can enjoy and can be themselves regardless of their gender identity. And also when it comes to this LGBTQIA plus community, it's important to prioritize that. And yes, because they have been long facing this discrimination, exclusions, and violence in all settings, including in faith community. Yeah, the core value of every religion mentioned that we are to be kind. And Buddhism itself, for example, is a religion that emphasizing compassion, wisdom, and mindfulness. It teaches us that all beings are equal and worthy of the respect, regardless of their gender identity. In fact, Buddhism teaches us so that non-attachment, we do not attach to the labor. But what's happening now is that some of the Buddhist cultures have been less accepting of this community. But this is not necessary that reflect what have been said by the Buddha. So we have to differentiate this, the culture and the teaching. How do we interpret that? And so, but however, in the recent years, INEP and its network trying to include that, and what we do is that we just sit down with our friends and have them speak their mind. So through the active listening, through the power sharing, so then they can have the power within and brought them up to the level where they can speak their mind without judgmental. So I would like to conclude here. Leaving no one behind is a concrete effort from individuals, faith leaders, us, civil society, government, institutions. So, and also private sector, medias. So we must work to break down this barrier and create a society that is truly inclusive, where everyone had the opportunity to enjoy their life with no judgment. And by prioritizing the gender equality and social inclusions, that's where we can ensure a more and just world for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking to that group, that vulnerable group who are so frequently left behind. And I think what's so interesting about choosing the LGBTQ plus group to speak about, and we'll come back to this more in the discussion, is from the perspective of faith and religion, which is what we're here talking about. This is the only group of all of the groups we serve in which they are left behind in many cases by design. Other ones end up left behind operationally due to a whole variety of different factors, whether it's access, whether it's ease of finding them. But this community is a community where very frequently, most frequently, they are deliberately left behind because they are seen as those who are choosing of their own accord to act out of God's instructions or out of righteousness or out of just the right thing to do. And I think it's a beautiful point that you've raised, and a very important place for us as religious leaders to really have to think about amongst ourselves. And I can tell you it's already something that's certainly happening within Hindu leadership, because it's something I'm seeing personally a lot. as more and more people are coming out, the leadership is having to reevaluate the perspective of this is wrong, this is a mistake, just, you know, do your best, set your mind, you know, and you'll be fine, as though somehow it were just a choice of the mind. And I can tell you it's happening, but it needs to happen a lot more and on a lot larger scale. Not just for discrimination, but actually for the provision of so much that we provide, as well as just for basic human rights to not be excluded. So it was a beautiful place for our discussion to start. Thank you. It's a wonderful honor now to turn the mic over to Mr. Oscar Mundia, who is the UNHCR Chief of Mission for India and the Maldives. And I'd like to begin with asking him, in your work, what are the greatest challenges that you see to not leaving people behind? And along with that, if possible in the first round, if not, don't worry, we'll come back. In your experience, are there solutions to these challenges?
Where do you place this thing? Is it coming on? Right. Thank you so much for inviting me in this forum. First and foremost, let me express myself to the extent that...
They can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Right. When I was first asked by my colleague Şafak to participate in this forum, I was taken aback because I really didn't know what to say in terms of religious background that this forum is all about. But as somebody working in UNHCR for quite a long time, let me say that first and foremost, the period that we are in the world is a very difficult period, because at this moment we have over 104 million people who are displaced. Think about that number. This is roughly the population of a country like Ethiopia that are displaced in one form or the other. They are internally displaced people, they are stateless people, they are refugees, they are migrants. They are all categories of person who are displaced. 83% of those people are in the global south. And that is to say that those people find themselves in situations that they themselves require a lot of support. In UNHCR, of course, we have within the international community, since I believe 4 or 5 years ago, come up with a framework to get support, to involve many more people, because we realize that with such a huge group of displacement, there needs to be a framework that where everybody can help. If I could bring it a little bit by home here in India, India has a history of welcoming people, dating to the years of separation. So it is very well placed to receive and to cater and to provide a succor to people who are fleeing violence and all manner of crisis. At the very moment as we speak, India is receiving refugees from Myanmar. India has received refugees from as far as Afghanistan. we have refugees from Sri Lanka. At the moment, I think we have close to 100,000 people. India has refugees from Tibet. They've been here for years, and I would really say in these last two categories of refugees, India has welcomed those refugees in a way that it's almost like they are citizens of this country. And what does that mean? That means that those refugees have access to jobs, they have access to documentation, and I want to come back to this issue later on, because it's really an example of what we are trying to mirror within the Global Compact for Refugees, whereby we not only support refugees, but also the communities that host refugees. Because the first line of protection of refugees is not government. Government, yes, from a legal point of view, but the communities within which they find themselves. And this becomes even more important in the Global South, because many of the communities in the Global South are themselves in need of assistance. You asked me, what is it that we need to do?
What are the challenges?
What are the challenges that
and the solutions?
And solutions that we need to find for refugees? The first one, of course, is legal status. Many countries find themselves crossing borders. You all are aware of this, that some countries are erecting borders so that people cannot come. Some countries, even when people find themselves within borders, it becomes another challenge. They are put in prison, they are seen through a security lens, they are forced to all manner of things. So they learn from one problem from their country, and they come into the country where they have sought protection and find themselves even in much more difficult situations. So the primary thing that refugees must have is legal protection. Legal protection. The second thing is access to services. My colleague Oppo here was talking about leaving no one behind. Refugees are in a very special place because unlike other migrants, they cannot go back to countries where they came from. So they must, we must, as a community and with the help of religious leaders, help to accommodate them and to provide them that legal access. Let me say, let me say that there are many, many things. I don't want to read you the whole list of the things that I think would mitigate this, because I think it is better that we discuss it in the conversation that you alluded to earlier on. But just to touch on one or two of them. And one of the most important is documentation. Documentation. Think about it. Here in India, all of you know that India is really truly on the rise. And if you try to trace the reason why India is on the rise, you could possibly trace it to one or two things. One or two things. And the primary one is a card called Aadhaar card. Those of you from this country will know it. Aadhaar card, what Aadhaar card does is that it takes your biometrics from wherever you are, and I think 90% of all the people in India have Aadhaar card, but Aadhaar card allows you to open a bank account. It allows you to access government services. It allows you to go to hospital and access A, B, C, D. But if you do not have a Aadhaar card in this country, obviously you are out of the system. So this is only one thing. And it is because of the Aadhaar cards, in my estimation, that India has been able to move very, very rapidly. Because people who are outside the system who could not, for example, access financial services or those manner of government programs, etc., have suddenly been able to access those things. So I believe that documentation is is a very, very important thing. Because let's say, for example, you are a refugee. Officials at the village level, they don't know what government policy is. They do, but all those things filter down very, very slowly. So if you are, let us say, you are in Uttar Pradesh, somewhere in a village, and you come into contact with a government official, the first thing they'll ask you is, where is your Aadhaar card? Yeah? Where is your Aadhaar card? You say, no, I am a refugee, I have a refugee card. You'll be at the back of the queue. Huh? You'll be at the back of the queue. Similarly, when you go to register your kid to school. Similarly, when you go to the hospital. Similarly, when you go to buy tickets. So this is critical. Documentation is critical. There are many, many more ingredients that can help in terms of minimizing inclusion. But of course, I think it would be better leave it like that for the time being. We can go back to this. But in terms of India, I think it is very, very important to plug into these kinds of structures and systems. And I imagine it is the same in many parts of the world. If you are not in the national, let us say, national legislation, or you do not have a document that allows you or that is recognized, obviously you always be in the back foot. So let me stop there for the time being.
Thank you so much. That was a very detailed, filled, thoughtful, and thought-provoking few minutes of sharing with regard to the plight of refugees and displaced people. We all know some aspect of that plight. We can imagine on some level, even if we've never experienced anything like it, what it might be like, how horrible it might be. We're now in a situation, though, with regard to the climate crisis, where by United Nations estimates, by 2040, we could have up to hundreds of millions more refugees simply due to climate, simply due to rising seawater, lack of water, and other climate-induced situations. So as we look at the problem of refugees, it's not only how do we deal with the ones we have, it's this interlinking, interconnected aspects of all of the SDGs and of all of the aspects of development that we're all working in, because on the one hand, we're working over here to help the refugees we have, but on the other hand, if we're not working over here to abate the climate crisis and do whatever we can to protect water, all we're doing is allowing even more refugees to come up. I wanted just to mention also with regard to the point about the Aadhaar card, it was such a thought-provoking point because one of the aspects with the card that the government of India did was eliminate the middleman. Our Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji was very, very committed to removing as much corruption as he possibly could. And one of the places for corruption was in the middleman for things like getting gas cylinders, getting anything that people in villages need, for example, getting subsidies for the farms. They always had to go through someone who would theoretically act on behalf of the poor person, collect the subsidies, get the gas cylinders. But of course, the corruption was insane, the commissions were insane, and very little of that which the government was providing actually was getting back to the poor person. So what the government did was they linked the Aadhaar card to the bank account. It's not just that you need it to get a bank account, but it's linked, and it's linked to the mobile phone. So that if you get subsidies for your farm, if you get the gas cylinder, if you get anything that people are getting provided by the government, money, it's actually coming directly into your account via your phone. Great for the removal of corruption. Very difficult if you don't have an Aadhaar card then, because then there's no way to then link it to the account, to the phone, and to avail yourself of any of these services. So that was a very interesting point that I had not thought of. Thank you so much for highlighting that and the importance of documentation wherever we are, not just for legal status, but actually for getting all of those benefits. Yes, of course.
Yes, could I just add that when we look at the various refugee groups that we have in this country, because some of them actually do have a Dhaka. The Tibetans, for example, the Sri Lankans have access to that. You can almost see the difference in the way that they are able to improve their livelihoods. Never mind all those other elements of difficulties that they face, but because when you have those cards, you are able to have a livelihood that helps your family.
Yeah.
And we can compare with, because some of the groups don't have access to this. For example, the Myanmar group doesn't have, the Afghan group doesn't have. You can see the differences. So it is very, very important. And it is not just important here in India. It's important everywhere. It's important everywhere that refugees are afforded a means to have their full potential, and that potential involves them being allowed into the national structure that exists, whatever it is. It could be a Dhaka, it could be somewhere else in different places of the world.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next and final speaker from the dais, and then we'll turn to some more interaction with all of you, is Professor Amitab Kundu, who is a Professor Emeritus from the Lok Jagruti University, which means awakening the people, that which is truly awakening all of the people. So it's wonderful to have you with us. And I would ask you to share with us what actual programs, activities do you see as being critically necessary in order to ensure that no one is left behind?
Thank you. Sadhvi, Bhagawati, Saraswati ji, Oscar, Opur, and the distinguished participants of this very important session. It's a privilege and honor for me to be a part of this G20 Interfaith Forum, which is being organized along with many other G20 platforms which I'm attending in a country which is the most populous in the world for the last 20 days. It has got that status. And think about a country which has 1,400 million plus population with different communities coming up. There are different histories, different geographies, different cultural background, different communities at different levels of socio-economic development. And I must say I was very humbled by Oscar when he said that India has received waves of migrants over history for 4,000 years. Whether they came as an invader, friends, but they all settled down because of the hostile, the bonhomie that we had, and that certainly is something which makes us proud. And until very recently, any refugee application in India did not make any distinction on the basis of your religion. It's some small little changes which has happened, which we are discussing, but nonetheless, that's a great strength. And as Oscar was pointing out, the documentation is an issue which has become important not only for those who are coming from outside, but even for those who have lived here, they have to go for the documentation. That is creating small little problems, so that we are trying to settle down. But now, answering your question, Dr. Saraswati, you see, with a history of 4,000 years, different communities, develop different prejudices, different kind of sense of discrimination, deprivation, and that gets manifested. In this large country, in the newspapers you must be reading, Manipur has problems. These are, because there are states which are larger than countries in Europe. So these things would happen. It's a big challenge that India is facing and is trying to resolve. Now, you said that what kind of specific things can be done. I would just mention from a study called India Discrimination Report, where we have tried to analyze what is the largest vulnerable community, what are the problems that they are facing, and how this government, which has envisioned and sincerely committed to the idea of no one should be left behind, how it is trying to make an effort so that the delegates who come from different countries, the G20 countries and also other countries, what kind of lessons they will carry back from India. That this is a big challenge which nowhere else exists in the whole world. Thousands of years of history, different communities coming, interacting, developing, as I said, rough edges between each other, and how the state policies, social environment, NGOs, private sector work together to resolve those small little conflicts. I just mentioned some of the issues of conflict because you should not hide things behind the carpet, but we are trying to sincerely resolve these. I'll just mention 2-3 things in response to your question, Dr. Saraswati. The report says that the largest vulnerable community, a very serious vulnerability, is that of women. Take any index of gender by international agencies, India does pretty badly, despite the fact that India is predicted to be $10 trillion economy. Asian Development Bank says 21st century belongs to Asia, 21st century belongs to India. That would happen if we address some of these issues they are just mentioning. Inequality in the access to education, inequality in the access to health facilities and labor market. This study shows that the discrimination, gender discrimination is 100%. The mathematical model calculates that education and the endowment for the woman doesn't make any difference in her access to labor market. I'm just giving you an example. The number of graduate women in India who are in labor market, the number of graduate women who are not in labor market are the same. That means whether you are a graduate or not, it doesn't matter whether you will be in the labor market or not. So this, basically the model says that the educational endowment does not increase your chances of going to the labor market. That does not necessarily mean that employer is discriminating. Society is discriminating. The family does not allow the ladies to go out. The husband may say, oh, we have children, you have to look after. So nonetheless, the overall impact is 100% discrimination. And there are many programs which are being launched, and we know the number of girl child is much less than the number of boys because of feticide. Infant mortality rate for the girl child, maternal mortality rate is pretty high. They are systematically coming down over the past 20 years, but this is certainly one area of challenge. The second vulnerable community are the ethnic people, the tribal population, and scheduled caste population. There are certain castes. We are proud of our ancient history, but we are also a bit embarrassed that there is a domination of the upper caste. And for 4,000 years, people have been suffering. And you can't just change the whole thing within 20, 30 years, but the process is on. And our study shows that in the urban areas, discrimination of these tribal population, scheduled caste population in the urban areas have gone down significantly. Significantly. It is basically because of the reservation in the jobs, in education. I'm just saying that what are the messages that India can give as with the presidency to the whole world and to the G20 countries. So that is something which is significant, but in the rural areas, unfortunately, it continues, but it has gone down to 55% to 27%. That is the model which shows that there is happy trend. The third discrimination, area of discrimination, is the religious minorities. This has been, there are instances which has come up, it is being flashed, nothing to hide from friends. And we do find that the discrimination in the religious minorities, the most depressed religious minorities are the Muslims in India. You do find that in the rural areas, there is no discrimination against Muslims because they are in certain professions, artisan class, they're in non-agricultural sector, they have a specialization. So there is no competition between the Muslims and other communities. But in the urban areas, you do find there is a significant discrimination, and during the period of the COVID, you found that this discrimination increased. Again, the government is taking measures to address that, but nonetheless, the societal factors are quite strong and it takes time to address that. So as I mentioned, our report does show that in the urban areas, the discrimination in the labor market, we have only talked of the labor market discrimination. And then there are other communities like children, elderly population, where you find the same problems as in China being left behind. Migration takes place, the elderly goes to the urban areas. But I must tell you, the problem is much less than other East Asian countries because family is slightly stronger. The percentage of children left behind with the elderly people is much smaller. India reports one of the lowest pregnancy below the age of 18. That's also one of the positive things. But nonetheless, there are areas of concern with regard to the gender empowerment and also, as I mentioned, about the scheduled caste population and this problem about discrimination against the religious minorities. But as far as physically challenged is concerned, I would like to end with that. As far as the refugees are concerned, as I mentioned, that India has been hospitable, but the documentation has become an issue for the migrants coming with a different religion. This has become recently an issue, but I think this is being addressed in the course of the administrative this thing. The point I would like to conclude by saying, as far as the physically and mentally challenged population is concerned, I chaired the government committee, and would you believe India records only 3% as population who are reporting any, physically or mental challenge. Whereas in the United States with the same definition, it is 18%. So I was very happy that India with a high level of malnutrition and other problems, we have such a low rate of physically challenged percentage people. That's basically because there is no incentive. There is no incentive for the family to report that my son is challenged, my daughter is challenged, there is a taboo. Now, as the programs are increasing for taking care of the physically challenged population, the reporting is increasing. So I was feeling that 3% vis-a-vis 18% is a great number, but certainly my happiness disappeared because basically it is because of the programs not being there. And now I think as we are developing more programs, you find percentage of such people is increasing over time. I hope I have addressed some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, which touched upon so many aspects of vulnerable communities, the challenges, but also the successes, and some indications of places and ways that we may find more success to lower discrimination. So whether it's through greater education, whether it's through greater access to jobs, that if there were more jobs, there would be less discrimination because of the job market. I would like, we have exactly half an hour left, and what I'd like to do, because I realize sitting amongst us, we also have so many people who are doing such fantastic work in the fields with women, with children, with displaced populations, and with so many other groups. So I'd like to extend and expand this circle. Sometimes we have the ability to actually sit in a circle in these breakout sessions. Here we don't, but I do want you to feel like we're in a circle, and turn to you all for any either questions to the panel or personal thoughts, suggestions, ideas, responses to these questions. I will just give you again the guiding questions for the session that I've presented to the panelists, but as we now turn it to you, if anybody has either questions for them or from your own experience, your own work, thoughts that you have on these questions. So the first is, of course, the major challenges that are involved, but as we said, along with challenges, if you can give solutions, successes, best practices, that's always great. And which communities are of specific concern to you in your work. And one that we haven't yet addressed, although Dr. Kundu did reference the children, is what are priority actions needed to protect and support children during this time of multiple crises? So I open it to all of you here. I know we have some experts here in the front on that. Yes, Maria Lucia, and then Fred, and then we'll move back. I'm sorry? We had 2 more speakers. One could not come. And then our sister, because she's also from the UNHCR, suggested that her colleague representing India should be on the panel and that she would absolutely join in with her thoughts from the audience. And as you speak from the audience, I'll ask you just to give your name and a quick title introduction of who you are so we know your frame of reference.
Thank you so much, Maria Lucia Uribe from Arigato International, and thank you so much for these very enriching discussions. I would like to touch upon the topic of stigmatization and stigma as a part of dehumanizing those who are left behind. And I was very touched, Opor, when you mentioned, of course, the LGBTQ plus community. And there is much more than the structural violence that is inflicted upon this group and many others that, as you mentioned, Professor, are left behind. There is the dehumanization of this other, of this different other. And I think it's in that part where religious communities have a very important role to play, because it's cultural violence, it's the justification with certain beliefs that this part of the population should be left behind or shouldn't be included. And I would like to hear examples. This is a challenge. This is a problem that we see even inside our religious communities. The stigma of the role of women, the stigma of the lack of capacity of young people, the stigma with the LGBTQ community. And the stigma also about refugees and their role in the host community. So I would like to hear examples, concrete examples of how can we challenge stigmatization. It's cultural violence. How can we challenge stigmatization? And I understand that the network of engaged Buddhists have been working on the topic of LGBTQ communities. What can be done? And how do we challenge religious practices that condone violence against these populations?
This is a little bit embarrassing. Arigato International, Fred Nyabera. Thank you very much for your presentations. 3 quick comments, questions. One is, do you see the need of addressing some of the root causes of vulnerability so that we're not just dealing with the end? And then secondly, there's the intersectionality of vulnerability. We cannot assume that all women are vulnerable in the same way, but if you're a woman from minority community, maybe from another faith, you might be more vulnerable than the others. So the need for addressing the intersectionality of vulnerability, because these don't happen in a vacuum, might be something to look into. And the last one is more of a solution. You talked about children being left behind. As Arigato International, picking up Leave No One Behind mantra of the UN, and also our GNRC 5th Forum, we decided to come up with SDG Academy for Children, a safe space for children to engage in the discussion, but also bring out their voices and active participation and solutions and issues that do affect them. So that's one solution that I'd like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Lucia and Fred. We'll come back to more comments in a moment. I want to just give the panelists a chance to respond to these, and then we'll take more. So I'll just repeat the topics that have been presented very quickly, and then ask each of you to choose 1 or 2, however they fit in with your experience and expertise to respond to. So we're looking at issues of destigmatization. How do we address stigmatization? How do we end stigmatization so that that stigma no longer is part of the society that we live in? And issues of root causes. What actually are these root causes? May we address them as root causes rather than waiting for the symptoms to be exacerbated and become crises, as well as this intersectionality between various vulnerable groups. So let's start with Opor over there, and then we'll just move down.
So, yes, this is better. Thank you, Maria Lucia, for the questions, which give the space to talk about this further and in depth. So, you see, once we empower women, the women didn't leave others behind, and we say that, hey, they are friends. We see along the way that have been left behind. Let's invite them. So what we did is like in April there was the summer ordinations with the bhikkhuni around. So bhikkhuni is the female monk which have not been recognized in the Sangha. So what we did first, we worked with the religious leader, the woman peace builder, and the ordained women. So here we bring up the power within. So then they say that the bhikkhuni say that let's have the first ordination where we invite all human beings to ordain, which we don't have the participant there yet because of the stigma. Why is that? there was a time when we invite the monk to talk about this, and they say that this is because it's your past life that you have done something wrong, and they only talk about a man and woman. So where does this information came from? I humbly and with all respect, I wonder if this is Buddha said. I don't think so. I don't, and he's mentioned that everyone can be enlightened, so why not others? And why am I saying still others? I have a lot to unlearn and relearn. So yes, a concrete example would be that we work with a women group, and then the women group bring others. Yes.
Thank you very much. In terms of this topic of stigma, can you hear me? Can you hear me at the back?
Yes, now.
Yeah, stigma is, of course, something that in UNHCR we have to deal with every day. But I think I really like what Dr. Kundu said earlier on, that some of these topics is a process. Is a process that countries and community needs to tackle. And for us in UNHCR, one of the things that we really do, and I want to go back a little bit. India is, as you heard from Dr. Kundu, is 1.4 billion people. What you need to see is that out of that 1.4 billion, 1 billion is below the age of 35. Below the age of 35. What that means is that you have to be able to speak to India, you have to be able to speak to that 35 million people. Of course, there are very many ways of speaking to that 35 million, 35%. And for us in UNHCR, what we do is to, first and foremost, to look at our population. The population, again, is similar to what we have in India, i.e. more than half of the refugees are youngsters. And therefore, the people who would be able to speak to them, for example, musicians, these social medias that are available, for us to create those messages, those positive messages, for refugees to be seen in a different light, other than just a problem. I do recall last year when we were celebrating the 75th anniversary of India, we had one of the young musicians here in India who is very well known, put together a group of 20 refugees and mentor them. And they sang the national anthem on that day. So on one day alone, people across India saw refugees singing or renditing the national anthem. That changes, even if you changed 20,000 people or 100 people, is a positive thing because they see refugees in a different way. When refugees come to the magistrate, the local magistrate at the local level, they remember, I saw that person singing the national anthem. Symbols are very important in terms of combating stigma. Our president, the president of India today, is a woman from the scheduled groups. Yeah? So these symbols are very, very important in slowly, step by step, addressing some of these stigmas. For UNHCR, of course, I already spoke a little bit about the Global Compact for Refugees. This is also a forum where we bring people together across the globe to see different examples of combating stigma, of addressing root causes, of sharing examples, Because sometimes when you sit in Sudan or in Chile or in Zimbabwe, you think you are the only one with the refugee question. But when you bring those people together, they start seeing things from different perspectives. And that is the whole essence of bringing together people under the global compact, so that we can share best examples, things that have worked somewhere else, and try to encourage countries and communities to adapt those practices that are working somewhere else. So maybe I can stop there.
While agreeing with Oscar, let me extend it further. Oscar, you don't mind taking advantage of my age? I'm addressing you by your first name, okay? You see, talking about prejudices, stigmas, I would be slightly provocative. Let me talk about stigma about Muslims, the Islamophobia. This is before 25 years. I was asked by European Union in Brussels to do a study to find out how many people will migrate from Asia to Europe. I'm talking about 25 years ago. They said they want to have breakup country-wise, gender-wise, and most importantly, how many Muslims will come from Asia to Europe. So I specifically said that, well, India, we don't ask that blunt kind of a question. Why is this question there? He said, there are cultural differences, it's difficult to adjust, there are some societal issues. I was really surprised. But as I said, largely, even in India, there is one reason. We asked, what is the reason for this stigma? There is a narrative which has been built up that Muslims have a very high fertility rate. And after 3-4 decades, they will overtake the local population. And that narrative has been talked about. If you read UNHCR's report, which has been released on 20th of April, 2023, it says that wrong reading of the demographic data creates such prejudices. If you look at the fertility rate of the Muslims, compare it with that of Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, you find Muslim fertility rate is higher than all communities. But what you forget is that past 20 years, the fastest decline has taken place for the Muslim fertility. Give them education. The moment you give education, you find the fertility rate goes down significantly, particularly for the Muslim woman. So I believe that this feeling that the local people, indigenous people will be overtaken, and that could be one of the reasons for this kind of a stigma which is there, and which is, as I said, is not in India, it's also there underlying, but in most countries, as I started by saying about Europe. I'll just make one more small point. Since Oscar was talking about refugees, and India has been one of the most liberal laws, do you know India has a problem that in the south of the country, the total fertility rate has gone down to less than 2, which means within 2-3 decades, or within a decade, they will have problems. Even now they're having problems of lesser number of children, high dependency rate, like China. Whereas North has a fertility rate near 3. So now what is happening is the labor force is growing very rapidly in the North, and South requires the labor force. But there are regional tensions coming up. Not as serious as with the refugees, but this is there is a law and order problem in any of the southern cities. They say, oh, maybe the migrants have come from the other states. So this is coming in the way of one world, one family, because within the country also the migration is becoming difficult because, again, some cultural factors and such wrong narrative that law and order problem is created by the migrants. You don't realize that, statistically speaking, you do find that the local people find it much more comfortable and easy to commit crime than the migrants, Of course, there are high level of unemployment, but this, I think, such false narratives which the UNFPA document strongly condemns, which has just been released before 20 days, needs to be addressed statistically. Since I am a teacher of statistics at the university, regional development, I always say that wrong narratives built on wrong data creates these stigmas and prejudices. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your honesty and also for the clarity. I think so many of the problems in the world stem from false information. Whether we call it false facts, whether we call it alternative truths, whatever semantics we use, we are all seeing all over the world in a whole variety of forms the devastation that is brought upon people when we do not speak truth, whether we are deliberately lying or whether we are simply misreading, misinterpreting, mismassaging facts and data and information to suit our own agenda. So thank you so much for that. I wanted very quickly just to also respond to Maria Lucia's question about stigmatization, because we are doing a lot of work around that and have found that throughout the world, of course, but especially in a country like India, where people are so ready to take the values, ethics, beliefs, norms, truths from their religious leaders as it is spoken. We're really utilizing the power of major religious gatherings to change how people think about everything, ranging from women's role in the society, in the home, in the workplace, to menstrual hygiene, to child marriage, to LGBTQ, to the whole spectrum of stigma, using very, very large religious gatherings to address these issues. So whether it's mega fairs and festivals, whether it's kathas that people come together at, or whether it's just our evening sacred Ganga Arti ceremony, where each evening we take up topics of social importance. We honor all of the United Nations days and utilize them as just a way in to talk about all of the different topics that are so critical. You've got people for an hour, they're there full of faith, they've come to pray, and as religious leaders to give them a message about whether it's cleanliness, whether it's protecting water, whether it's the environment, whether it's girls, whether it's those who are disabled, whether it's those who are different in any way. It's a great opportunity to harness that. So it's something that we've been doing a lot of. We also had a specific LNOB, Leave No One Behind, conference in which we brought 16 different groups of vulnerable communities together at the ashram for 3 days and did all of the work between us on how can we reach these people. And we brought, of course, government together to see how we can get more and more access to all of the provisions to them, but also did a very large public event highlighting all of these different groups, again, to change awareness. So I think a lot of it really has to do with just getting out there and being vocal about it in spheres and circles where you are hitting the masses. And I think the more people hear about it, the more the way people think about it changes, especially when they're hearing about it from their religious leaders. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to just take ideally as many hands up as we have so everyone who has a chance to speak feels heard. So I will then ask you to try to keep your comments or questions as brief as possible. Yeah, Namesha, and then we'll head back.
So basically my question is to Professor Kundu here, because he's from social sciences and he was heading my department. So when we're talking about, you rightly pointed about children and how, regional and urban differences are there in rural and urban spaces, the discrimination has been changing. We have to understand, like, there is an acceptance that, especially in JNU, when we are coming from JNU, that places like JNU and DU are places where people from various backgrounds come, rural and urban. How as an educational institution, because you were heading it, you can give a better idea, how as an educational institution we can build up a safe space where youngsters are able to develop and come up and bringing more impactful changes for the vulnerable communities as a whole. Because that is where the youngsters these days, we either feel very disconnected with the ideas of vulnerable communities, or we get an ego of the self-community that comes first of all. In that case, how do we sensitize the case, and how do we build up an impact beyond the statistical thing that we study in our classrooms? Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. And then to the woman here in the third row. Up, unko de dijiyega bhi. Aapko. Idhar.
Yeah, I have a related question, Professor. I was also a student of JNU. You mentioned about, the discrimination in the urban areas not really being there so much as in the rural areas. But we also read in the newspapers often, like how the students who are coming from rural areas, especially, from the socio-economically marginalized sections, they also struggle. And many a times, some of them actually end their lives because they're not able to cope with what is happening to them, or the kind of treatment that is meted out to them, especially in professional colleges, whether it's medicine or engineering. And I think from time to time we read that. So I just wanted to understand what your perspective is. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself. My name is Vijay Lakshmi and I work with Catholic Relief Services. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And in the back, there's a hand raised.
Hello, yeah, Eugene Yap from Malaysia. I think we know that the root causes or the causes behind vulnerable communities are not just one size fits all. It's multi-dimensional, it's multilateral, and it's probably holistic causes. There's no one cause that contributes to vulnerable communities. So consequently, when we talk about solutions or even remedies, it cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. It has got to be a multilateral, multi-dimensional, and holistic solutions. So, and such solutions cannot come without institutional or structural input or structural reforms. So perhaps I'd like to hear from the panel, what would you think, or perhaps share with us some of the structural institutional inputs or structural institutional undertakings that can actually contribute to meaningful solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we turn back to the panel with our 2 minutes left, I wanted to just, Şafak, is that how you pronounce it? I wanted to turn to you because you were originally on this panel. And before we run out of time, I wanted to just see if you would like to share something with us. And then while there won't be time for the panelists to respond to the questions that were just asked, we do have a tea break coming up after this. So feel free, of course, to speak to them individually and get all of the excellent wisdom and experience. Yes, Şafak.
Thank you very much, and we have more time at tomorrow's plenary as well to discuss things, so thank you for the kind invitation of Baha'i community. And thank you, Sandy, for inviting, for any comments. My colleague Oscar actually put it in a perspective to give very concrete, living daily examples of being a refugee and being left out because of basically was not considered, documentation was not considered. For instance, that makes things much more real in the eyes of when we speak of vulnerable communities and not leaving anyone behind. Sometimes those communities actually choose to be invisible as well, not to be targeted. So the hardest part is not to come with what we are battling with, where we have the normative international standards for protection. I mean, now more or less we can say, Oscar, no, in 75 years of UN history, and with ours coming out of, in 51, the Refugee Convention, coming out of the ashes and tragedies of huge human displacement around the World War II, following post-World War II. So it was built, and the norms and standards are there, and states are more or less, after all this decades of building up and being part of the international community, comes with this kind of conditions, being a respectful member. So more or less they're on board. I mean, more or less we can say many of the conventions out there are ratified, states are on board, including the Human Rights Convention, respective ones. But it's not about that. Just like the legislations inside the House, inside national and local systems, if you don't come up with the cultural campaign in parallel to that, it means nothing to a common person sometimes, like myself as well. If I am not made aware of it, and if I'm not consulted about it at the very beginning, then that legislation or international standard may mean nothing when the professor was speaking about how the urban population may feel towards Muslim migrants rather than compared to the rural. Those dynamics come to play much more easily. So, and then I was very also intrigued, Professor, by your indication of the disabilities part, because one may connect it, perhaps very rightly so, according to your research, the incentive packages and the benefits that may be there, but there are also those unspoken discrimination in the cultural codes that may prevent the families to come out and say it out loud that they may have a child with disability or register that child, because it may be such a stigma around it that they may actually choose, rather than getting a benefit, they may choose to keep that child out of society, not to be exposed to discrimination as a family as a whole. So I think when it comes to interfaith and faith, solutions may lie very much in the cultural campaigns that's in the hands of interfaith community. So I would like to bring it to that. Maybe we have a lot to offer as well from this community that is gathering here from all kinds and all parts of faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just to underscore your final line, which is why we're all here, because we recognize the great power of the world of faith and the faith communities, faith itself, faith leaders, and our faith communities.